Top 10 Most Dangerous Inmates in the U.S. Prison System. The Isolation Unit at ADX Florence. The United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, known as ADX Florence, is the most secure federal prison in the United States. Located in Florence, Colorado, it houses inmates considered too dangerous, too disruptive, or too high profile for other federal institutions. The facility opened in 1994. It was designed for control. Inmates at ADX are held in single-occupancy cells for approximately 23 hours a day. Each cell measures about 7 by 12 feet. The walls are solid concrete. The furniture is poured concrete. Movement is controlled electronically. Meals are delivered through a slot in the steel door. Human contact is minimal and regulated. This is not a temporary holding environment. Many men remain here for years. Some have spent decades under these conditions. Federal Bureau of Prisons policy refers to this as administrative maximum custody. Former wardens have described it publicly as a place for the worst of the worst. In 2012, a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of inmates challenged conditions at ADX, arguing that prolonged solitary confinement caused severe psychological harm, particularly for prisoners with pre-existing mental illness. Court filings documented inmates who had spent years without meaningful social interaction. Some described hallucinations. Others described panic attacks and cognitive decline. The Bureau of Prisons acknowledged that inmates at ADX experience extreme isolation but maintain that placement decisions are based on security needs. Cells are designed to limit communication between inmates. Recreation, when permitted, takes place alone in enclosed concrete exercise pens sometimes described by former prisoners as resembling empty swimming pools. The sky is visible only through a narrow opening. Direct eye contact with another inmate is rare. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture has stated that prolonged solitary confinement beyond 15 days may constitute cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. At ADX, isolation can extend for years. Inmates identified by federal authorities as among the most dangerous in the country are assigned here. This includes individuals convicted of terrorism offenses, large-scale organized crime leadership, and repeated acts of violence within prison. Among the most widely reported inmates held at ADX has been Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, convicted in federal court in 2019 on charges including drug trafficking and criminal enterprise leadership. Court records confirm he was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 30 years and transferred to ADX shortly after sentencing. Federal prosecutors argued that his history of escape attempts required the highest level of security. Another inmate formerly housed here was Ramzi Youssef, convicted for his role in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. He received multiple life sentences in federal court. The Bureau of Prisons does not release full daily operational details, but publicly available inspection reports confirm strict movement protocols. Inmates are escorted in restraints. Conversations with staff occur through barriers. Programming opportunities are limited and conducted alone. Television, when permitted, is controlled and restricted. Communication with family is monitored. Silence becomes structural. In depositions filed during litigation, mental health experts described the effects of prolonged isolation as including anxiety, depression, hypersensitivity to stimuli, and difficulty reintegrating into social environments. Some inmates adapt to the routine. Others deteriorate. The architecture does not change. Lights turn on and off at scheduled times. Trays slide through the slot. Doors open only under command. 4 inmates classified as chronically violent within prison. ADX is considered the final level of domestic confinement before transfer to a federal supermax management unit. Placement decisions are reviewed periodically, but movement out of ADX is rare and gradual. The stated purpose of the facility is incapacitation. Control is total. Time passes without variation. There are no communal dining halls. No open dormitories. No shared yards. Every activity occurs alone. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that these measures prevent violence against staff and other inmates. Correctional officers assigned to the unit work in pairs. Video surveillance monitors corridors continuously. Contact is procedural, not conversational. The psychological impact of this environment has been the subject of extensive academic study. Research published in peer-reviewed journals has linked long-term solitary confinement to measurable cognitive and emotional changes. Findings include impaired memory, increased paranoia, and heightened stress responses. These effects have been documented across multiple correctional systems, not only at ADX. Yet ADX remains operational. It continues to house inmates assessed as presenting extraordinary risk. The men confined here represent a small fraction of the federal prison population. But their management defines the outer limit of American incarceration policy. This is where the federal system sends individuals it determines cannot be managed elsewhere. Inside these concrete cells, danger is contained through isolation. The cost is measured in silence. This is where our examination begins. Thomas Silverstein, A Life in Permanent Confinement. Before ADX Florence formally opened, the federal prison system had already begun experimenting with extreme long-term isolation for inmates considered uncontrollable within standard facilities. Thomas Silverstein became the most prominent example of that approach. Silverstein was born in 1952. In 1978, he was convicted in federal court for armed robbery and sentenced to 15 years in prison. While serving that sentence at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, he became affiliated with the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist prison gang documented extensively in federal court records. In 1983, Silverstein was convicted of killing correctional officer Merle Klutz at USP Marion. Court documents established that Klutz was stabbed repeatedly during a controlled movement within the prison. 2 days later, another correctional officer, Robert Hoffman, was killed in a separate incident involving another inmate. That period marked one of the most violent episodes in modern federal prison history. Shortly afterward, USP Marion implemented a permanent lockdown. Inmates were confined to their cells for nearly 23 hours per day. This operational model later became the blueprint for ADX Florence. Silverstein was also convicted of killing another inmate, Danny Atwell, at USP Marion. In total, federal court records reflect multiple life sentences added to his original term. Following these convictions, Silverstein was placed under what became known as no human contact status. According to Bureau of Prisons documentation and later court filings, this meant he was held alone in a specially designed control unit. Movement outside his cell required restraints and multiple officers. He was not permitted direct physical contact with other prisoners. Conversations occurred through barriers. 4 years, his confinement conditions exceeded even the restrictive standards later formalized at ADX. In 2007, Silverstein filed a federal lawsuit challenging his conditions of confinement. Court records from that litigation document that he had spent more than 2 decades in near-continuous isolation. By the time of his death in 2019, he had been held in solitary confinement for approximately 36 years. That figure is widely cited in Bureau of Prisons summaries and by investigative journalists who reviewed his case. The federal government argued that Silverstein's classification was based on documented violent conduct and ongoing security risk assessments. Officials maintained that his history of killing correctional staff required extraordinary precautions. His case was used internally within the Bureau of Prisons as justification for the development of high-security control units. Silverstein's attorneys argued that the duration and intensity of isolation caused measurable psychological harm. Court filings included references to depression, paranoia, and sensory deprivation. Mental health experts who reviewed his case described prolonged solitary confinement as producing cognitive deterioration in some inmates. The court did not order his release from isolation. Instead, administrative adjustments were made over time. In later years, records indicate that limited reforms allowed for slightly increased access to phone calls and monitored interactions. But he remained in single-cell confinement until his death. Silverstein died in federal custody in 2019 at age 67. The Bureau of Prisons stated that he died of natural causes. His total time in solitary confinement is considered the longest known continuous isolation term in the history of the federal prison system. His case became central to debates about administrative maximum custody. Correctional administrators cited institutional safety. Civil rights advocates cited constitutional concerns. The Supreme Court of the United States has not issued a categorical ruling banning long-term solitary confinement. However, individual justices have written opinions acknowledging the severe psychological impact of extended isolation. Silverstein's confinement shaped federal policy. USP Marion transitioned permanently into a control unit model after the 1983 killings. ADX Florence opened 11 years later, incorporating architectural features designed to minimize communication and prevent coordinated violence. In public statements, former Bureau of Prisons Director Norman Carlson defended the expansion of supermax facilities, describing them as necessary for managing inmates who commit violent acts even while incarcerated. Silverstein's name appeared repeatedly in congressional testimony and correctional policy discussions during the 1980s and 1990s. He was not a public figure before incarceration. He became one because of the structure built to contain him. His case illustrates a central question in the management of the most violent inmates. How long can isolation continue without measurable harm? Academic research conducted over several decades has examined individuals held in long-term solitary confinement across multiple states. Findings consistently show increased rates of anxiety disorders, depression, and self-harm behaviors among prisoners subjected to prolonged segregation. Federal facilities maintain that not all inmates experience the same effects. Individual resilience varies. Institutional policy emphasizes risk assessment over rehabilitation when violence occurs inside prison walls. Silverstein never returned to a general population unit. He never entered a communal dining hall again. He did not share recreation space with other inmates. The structure that confined him was reinforced over time, not dismantled. In the hierarchy of federal incarceration, his name remains associated with the expansion of permanent lockdown units. His record is documented in court transcripts, Bureau of Prisons memoranda, and federal sentencing orders. There is no speculation required. The sequence of events is preserved in public record. An armed robbery conviction. 2 murders inside prison. Multiple life sentences. Decades alone in a concrete cell. The federal system responded with architecture. With reinforced doors. With isolation as policy. Silverstein's case marked a turning point in how the United States manages inmates deemed persistently violent behind bars. It set the operational precedent for the facility introduced in the previous scene. And it established the modern template for administrative maximum confinement. The silence inside those cells did not begin with ADX. It began earlier. And it has continued. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, permanent supermax confinement. In July 2019, Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Lara was sentenced in federal court in Brooklyn, New York, to life imprisonment plus 30 years. The conviction followed a months-long jury trial in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York. Guzman was found guilty on multiple counts, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, international drug trafficking, firearms offenses, and conspiracy to commit murder. Federal prosecutors presented evidence linking him to leadership of the Sinaloa Cartel, a transnational criminal organization responsible for large-scale narcotics distribution. Court records document testimony regarding trafficking routes, financial operations, and internal enforcement practices within the organization. After sentencing, Guzman was transferred to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. He was designated to the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. ADX Florence is the same institution introduced in the opening scene. The Bureau of Prisons does not publicly disclose detailed placement criteria for individual inmates, but federal officials have stated in court filings that Guzman's history of escape attempts required the highest level of security available within the federal system. In 2001, Guzman escaped from a Mexican federal prison. In 2015, he escaped again from another maximum security facility in Mexico through a tunnel constructed beneath his cell. These documented escapes were presented by U.S. prosecutors as evidence of extraordinary flight risk. Since his transfer to ADX, publicly available information confirms that Guzman has been held under standard administrative maximum conditions. This includes single-cell confinement for approximately 23 hours per day. Movement outside the cell requires restraints and escort by multiple officers. Communication with other inmates is prohibited. Visits, when permitted, occur behind glass barriers. All communications are monitored. In 2020, Guzman's legal team filed motions in federal court arguing that his conditions of confinement were excessively restrictive and damaging to his mental health. Court filings described limited access to sunlight and restricted communication. Federal authorities responded that his confinement complied with Bureau of Prisons regulations and was necessary for institutional security. No court order has altered his placement. As of public reporting through 2025, Guzman remains incarcerated at ADX Florence. His case differs from Thomas Silverstein's in one critical respect. Silverstein's violence occurred inside federal prison walls. Guzman's designation was based largely on conduct outside the United States prison system and a documented history of coordinated escape. Federal officials cited the risk of external criminal networks attempting interference. ADX Florence was designed to eliminate such vulnerabilities. Cells are constructed to prevent tampering. Perimeter security includes multiple layers of fencing, motion detection systems, and armed patrols. Recreation occurs in enclosed spaces without shared contact. Mail is screened. Phone access is limited and recorded. The Bureau of Prisons has stated publicly that these measures are applied uniformly to inmates assigned to administrative maximum custody. Guzman's daily routine follows institutional schedule. Lights activate at designated times. Meals are delivered through the door slot. Legal documents are reviewed within the cell. Exercise, when permitted, occurs alone. There is no congregation. There is no communal program. In federal court transcripts, prosecutors described Guzman as having directed large-scale narcotics distribution operations over decades. The jury's verdict reflected those findings. The sentence of life imprisonment without parole ensures he will remain in federal custody for the remainder of his life. The transition from cartel leadership to solitary federal confinement represents a shift from expansive criminal networks to a 7 by 12-foot cell. The Bureau of Prisons does not publicly release psychological evaluations of individual inmates. However, research cited in prior litigation involving ADX has established that prolonged isolation can produce cognitive and emotional strain. Whether an individual adapts or deteriorates varies case by case. The structure remains constant. Correctional officers assigned to ADX operate under strict protocol. Interactions are procedural. Security classification reviews occur periodically, but movement out of ADX for inmates with life sentences and extraordinary security risk is rare. Guzman's presence at ADX reflects a broader federal strategy. When the court determines that a defendant's criminal history, influence, or escape risk exceeds conventional containment models, the administrative maximum facility becomes the default placement. The federal government's position, expressed in court filings, is that such confinement prevents further harm. There is no theatricality inside these walls. No public access. No media presence. The architecture is the control mechanism. Concrete replaces command structures. Isolation replaces network. The official record confirms the charges, the conviction, the sentence, and the designation. Beyond that, daily life is measured in regulated hours and controlled movement. This is how the federal system contains individuals it defines as exceptionally dangerous or exceptionally high risk. Not through spectacle. Through restriction. Through repetition. Through silence. Containment without end. The United States prison system holds more than 1 million people in state and federal custody. Only a fraction are confined under administrative maximum conditions. An even smaller fraction are classified as requiring permanent, high-restriction management. The individuals examined in this documentary were not selected for notoriety. They were selected because official records document sustained violence, leadership of organized criminal enterprises, acts of terrorism, or conduct inside prison that fundamentally altered institutional policy. The response of the federal system has been structural. Architecture replaces negotiation. Isolation replaces congregation. Control replaces proximity. Facilities like ADX Florence were constructed after documented killings of correctional officers and repeated institutional security failures. Their design reflects those events. Cells built of poured concrete. Minimal human contact. Movement regulated by electronic systems. Layers of perimeter defense. Periodic classification review, but limited reintegration. Federal policy maintains that such confinement protects staff, other inmates, and the public. Civil rights litigation has challenged the psychological impact of long-term solitary confinement. Courts have reviewed conditions. Some adjustments have been ordered over the years. But administrative maximum custody remains operational. The men housed under these conditions live within a schedule that rarely changes. Meal through a slot. Silence. Recreation alone. Lights out. Years pass in that rhythm. Some adapt. Some deteriorate. Official documentation shows both outcomes. The debate surrounding extreme confinement continues in courtrooms, academic journals, and legislative hearings. There is no simple resolution. The system balances institutional safety against human cost. The records are public. The sentences are final. The cells remain occupied. Inside these corridors, danger is managed through separation. Not through rehabilitation programs. Not through communal oversight. Through distance. Through reinforced steel. Through time. The question that remains is not whether these inmates committed serious crimes. Federal convictions and documented institutional violence confirm that. The question is how a system defines the outer boundary of control. How long isolation should last. What impact it leaves. And whether containment alone is considered sufficient. There is no dramatic ending here. No release date for most of the individuals discussed. No reversal of sentence. Only continued confinement under policy designed for the most restrictive tier of American incarceration. If you found this examination informative, you are invited to share your perspective respectfully in the comments. Engagement helps ensure that complex issues surrounding incarceration policy remain visible and examined. Thank you for watching and for approaching the subject with seriousness and care.